someone knocking at my door, like, knock, 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 knock. And I'm like, I don't know who you are, so I'm not going to answer it.
Now that's what I call effective operational security. It's Radio Free Innsmouth episode 310, picking up with part 2 of our Lucifugum series. This time around we will be covering their stuff released between 2001 and 2003, a 4-album period that one might call Lucifugum's transitional era. This was the era of them sowing their wild oats, and it's actually, despite what my gushing over Na Christi Hesha and the Path of the Wolf demo in the prior Lucifugum episode might lead you to believe, my personal favorite era of Lucifugum. These Lucifugum albums are also important to me personally because I first heard them right at the height of sort of my black metal elitism many years ago, where pretty much anything released in any kind of extreme metal context after 1996 generally made me go unless it happened to have a verse Sephira summoning or Arguslent as the band logo on the album cover. This era of Lucifugum was instrumental in my realizing that there actually was a future for black metal and it hadn't just peaked with Burzum and everything else was a mistake. Probably kept me from turning into a tobacco reviewer. If you know what I mean. And it's definitely a major reason that Radio Free Innsmouth continues to exist. Because Lucifugum's releases from 2001 through 2003 show that you can, in fact, make black metal in the relatively modern era that sounds like no one else and does something new and interesting without it turning into a bunch of avant-garde meanderings.
Not that there's anything wrong with that!
Everybody knows about my fondness for Psy and Arcturus and Peste Noire, but Lucifugum has generally always been black metal for the sake of black metal, and despite that, they have managed to push the genre into a lot of new directions, some of which occasionally get picked up on by later bands, and people don't realize that a lot of these artistic innovations were initially generated by Lucifugum. For instance, what one might call the final album of the classic Lucifugum era, And the Wheel Keeps Crunching. I call it sort of like the final classic Lucifugum album because it's the last one that has Balamith on guitars and bass. He died like right after it came out, and it's the last one that's got Faunus on vocals. He left right after it came out. This album's pretty important because it essentially invented the template for what one might call the modern Slavic atmospheric black metal style, and yet it doesn't seem to get a lot of credit for it. Like when you put this album on, you gotta remember this is before Druidic, before Cores, and yet from the first track, it literally sounds like something that could have come off a Druidic album released yesterday. In fact, and this might just be my own personal bias speaking, I think this is a lot better than most Druidic. Despite the fact that it predates the modern Druidic style, this album's actually a lot more complex in its songwriting. I mean, you're hearing how all that bass is weaving its way through those guitar layers. And there's also a little bit of palm-muted thrashiness to it that wouldn't be a part of Druidic. I mean, you wouldn't think that sort of palm-muting stuff would work in this atmospheric black metal style, but it really does help underscore the movement between different melodic themes. I don't know what you would call this sort of thing. Pastoral thrash? Definitely not a style of music I've heard anybody do quite like how Lucifugum does it. Hell, this album doesn't even really sound like any other Lucifugum stuff. There was hints of this direction on the On Hooks to Pieces album that came out right before this.
But
for the most part, that album kind of stuck within that symphonic black thrash mold they'd carved out for themselves, whereas this whole album is just this flowing outpouring of hateful black metal emotion that does, yes, kind of presage developments that would be made in the genre by Druidic, Cores, and especially Astrophase. It also manages to incorporate way more variations in sound than any of those bands ever really went towards when they were recording similar sounding material. I mean, sure, you got plenty of acoustic, folky sections with jaunty percussion like you'd expect to hear from any of those bands, but Lucifugum chooses to juxtapose that with some of the strangest black metal riffing I've ever heard. Like this part right here where they're utilizing that sort of repeating bass loop line that they innovated on the song Wolves from their Na Christi Hesha album, and then they just got the guitars doing this weird sort of accenting motion over top of it, before then transitioning into their unique synthesis of black and thrash metal and atmospheric black metal. Again, not really a style that anybody else has done too much with over the years. Definitely kind of blazing a new path for black metal that still is yet to be explored by most other bands. Also, for the far-right maniacs in the crowd listening right now, does this section right here not sound a whole lot like stuff Argus Lent would go on to do? That same sort of weird, like, bendy riffing style reinterpretation of old school heavy metal riffing in a more extreme metal context? I mean, maybe it's just me, but this sounds like something could have come off of incorrigible bigotry, no problem. For a lot of bands, an album like this would kind of be the peak of their career. But for Lucifugum, they were just getting started. Like I said earlier, this is the end of Lucifugum's classic era, because after this, the band is basically just the main guy, Klist, hiring a bunch of session musicians. In fact, each of the latter 3 albums we're going to cover on this episode have a slightly different lineup to them. And I figured, kind of like with the demo portion of the prior Lucifugum episode, we could go over them in order from my least favorite to my favorite. However, that said, all of these albums are amazing. My least favorite of this sort of mid-career trio is Back to Chop Down Roots, which features on guitar and vocals a fellow by the name of Pavel Shishkovsky from the band Lucifugum, who are themselves another highly underrated band from this part of the world. If you've never heard Lucifugum, it's basically this guy's one-man atmospheric black metal project with some really hateful, nasty sounding vocals. In fact, despite Back to Chop Down Roots being my least favorite of this era of Lucifugum, it's by far got my favorite vocal performance on it. Dude's got a uniquely hateful style that sounds like no one else. This is easily the catchiest and most melodic and immediate impact of Lucifugum albums from this time period. Drumming's also great, but what sets this album apart for me are the Lucifugum guy's amazing vocals. It's really hateful and unique and painful sounding. In terms of guitar riffage, this is probably the closest to their "And the Wheel Keeps Crunching" style, because this album's really built on that same sort of flowing melody. And the way those guitar melodies interlap with the surprisingly technical drum arrangements reminds me a whole lot of Nagura Bunjet, or maybe even very early Dimmu Borgir, like Stormblast era. This feeling is also enhanced by the fact that this is one of the less hateful sounding Lucifugum releases. Definitely a lot more melancholic in tone than I'm used to hearing from this band. And I can see why for a lot of people, this is their favorite Lucifugum album, because it's kind of their most standard black metal sounding one. That said, standard black metal for Lucifugum is still pretty out there. Speaking of out there, check out these fucking hateful, nasty vocals. Oh, you think he's fucking done? Check this shit out. My man is real fucking upset about something, which, you know, I'm sorry to hear that, but at the same time I'm glad, because it means he got to make those noises on this album. Back to Chop Down Roots also features one of the catchiest Lucifugum riff sets over the course of their entire career on the song Voice Torozatoi, or Hanging Thunderstorm. Almost kind of has an oriental flavor to its melody, and the production really helps out with this one, because you can hear how that bass guitar stands out, as well as the really ringing notes of the cymbals on the drum kit. That really prominent bass guitar tone actually reminds me a lot of earlier Marduk material, where a lot of times the best thing about a lot of those Marduk albums was that really prominent bass guitar, and there it was in service to, you know, some pretty good black metal riffage, whereas here, that bass is backing up these outstanding riffs. Speaking of which, here comes some downright orcish sounding shit.
Looks like meat back on the menu, boy.
Might also be able to make a comparison to earlier Satyricon. And then we jump back into that incredibly catchy cyclical riff from the beginning of the song. This riff was actually one of those moments that really made me sit up and take notice of Lucifugum when I got around to hearing it. And it's still one of my favorite moments in their discography to this day. However, like I said, Back to Chop Down Roots, amazing album, masterpiece, but it's still my least favorite of this era, Lucifugum. My second favorite Lucifugum album from this era is also probably their least accessible album, that being Sociopath Philosophy Cynicism. It's here that we get to turn our attention to the drummer on all 3 of these albums, Yuri Sinitsky, who is kind of like Mun Ruthel in that he's a pretty famous session drummer kind of guy. And yeah, he plays on all these albums, but Sociopath Philosophy Cynicism is the most Yuri Sinitsky-ish sounding album, just like how Back to Chop Down Roots was the most Lutomisla sounding album. What I mean by that is that it shares commonalities both in songwriting and sonic approach as well as lyrical content, because Yuri, his main band, is a death metal band called Definition Sane, whose general concept is sort of like mental illness and outrageous blasphemy. Definitely one of the most out there sounding death metal acts that I've ever heard. Definition Sane sounds spastic and disjointed without sounding like your standard sort of spastic, disjointed tech death band. In fact, I have a hard time thinking of any bands that sound exactly like Definition Sane. The closest comparison I can think of would be very early At the Gates, circa Red in the Sky Is Ours, mixed with a lot of Legion-era Deicide at their craziest. Definitely a band well worth checking out if you're into the weirder side of the Slavic scene or you just like really fucked up sounding death metal. But this style really bleeds over into Lucifugum's sociopath philosophy cynicism, which this time features a different guest vocalist, a mystery guy. For years and years, nobody knew who it was. It was one of those great Slavonic black metal unsolved mysteries.
Does it burn if you stick your dick in an onion? That would hurt. It's like, most likely that would hurt. I'm not going to frickin' try it.
Upon more recent research, apparently, it's some guy named Eligor from the bands Underdark, Torn Apart, and Asura, who I haven't heard any of their material. He sounds fucking wacky on this album, which also features no song titles. Every song is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, The cover is black and white. The concept is mental illness. That's what I mean when I say this is the most purposefully inaccessible Lucifugum album released to date. And man, is it a weird one. For starters, the guitar riffs are just fucking bizarre. And as if to match that bizarre tone, they also begin incorporating samples. Samples of what? I got no fucking idea. It sounds like a bunch of crazy people yelling a bunch of crazy shit about crazy things I don't know fucking nothing about. Really more just there for texture. But the frenzied nature of the samples included definitely matches the rhythmic idiosyncrasies of the music going on underneath. And that's what I mean when I say this is the most Yuri Sinitsky sounding album of this era of Lucifugum, because it's the one on which his weirdo drum style is used to its utmost. And it's the one that stylistically resembles his band Definition Sane the most. Yeah, maybe starting off with the seventh track, that Sociopath Philosophy Cynicism, was kind of throwing you guys into the deep end. I just wanted to show you what this album sounded like at its weirdest, because you do kind of need to be mentally prepared going into this one. It's a strange album. Even the more normal sounding songs that don't feature as many samples are still pretty fucking bizarre. Like every little riff usually has multiple different segmented components to it, kind of jammed together in a way that seems haphazard at first. But if you really pay attention, they actually do make musical sense, just a much stranger kind of musical sense. This is all linked together by the drumming from Yuri, which, as mentioned earlier, is definitely his most aggressive ever done for a Lucifugum album. The only time this album really slows down is when they go into thrash breaks like the one you're hearing right now. This riff right here is actually the one that got me into Lucifugum back in the day. It was the first Lucifugum song I ever heard. And I was pretty instantly mesmerized by their weird approach to black metal and thrash metal mixed together. Like this bit right here, the way this riff resolves in on that dissonant kind of chord, with that double bass drum rolling underneath it. Rhythmically, this is one of the strangest black metal albums I've ever heard. It has less in common with your standard sort of thrashing metal, and it feels more like an organically breathing organism at times. Although, it has to be said, it's very labored and diseased sounded breathing, which is befitting an album that is a weird concept thing about mental illness where all the tracks don't even have any fucking names. I don't know if I'd recommend this to most people as their first Lucifugum album, but it was the first one I heard and it got me into them, so I guess they were doing something right with it. But my favorite Lucifugum album of this period, and probably my favorite Lucifugum album overall, is actually their first one with a guest vocalist, that being Stigma Egoism, which features a very early performance from Roman Sayenko from Druidic and Hate Forest, where he doesn't really sound like he does on any other release. This album's actually even thrashier in some aspects than the two that came after it. In fact, it pretty much invented that sort of groovy thrashing style that bands like Dubbuk and Thundercraft would do so much with in subsequent years. In the comment section of the first Lucifugum episode, there was a guy talking about how he was surprised that he was enjoying the symphonic era of Lucifugum as much as he did, given that he usually preferred the more kind of chugging sort of caveman-ish end of the extreme metal spectrum.
The fuck you call me?
Well, you are a caveman, Sam.
Yeah, fucking caveman.
Listen, burger boy.
And I actually responded to him and said, hey, don't worry, second episode, they are totally going into that realm. And it is with this album that they really started to emphasize that aspect of the overall metal experience. I mean, this riff right here, this is pretty much emblematic of the caveman style that Lucifugum indulges in on this record. Kind of stuff that makes your lizard brain go. And when those other instruments kick in, it gets even more primitive and tribal sounding with this repeated acoustic guitar strum phrase and these very churning tribal sounding drums. Definitely a rhythmically intense release, and that means full stops. Like this one right here. And there's Roman from Drudic's vocals, which, like I said, don't sound like anything else this guy ever did. Very hateful shit, accompanied with this blackened, thrash, unrelenting assault we're being hit with. And yet it's pretty cleverly written. Like, this whole bit right here is actually a really clever sort of counterpoint riff to that grooving, kind of chugging caveman-ish intro part from the beginning of the song. And it really helps link all the different parts of the song together, which is good, because as you're hearing right now, the riffs in a lot of songs on this album tend to get pretty strange. And it takes a master composer's mind, like the one that Klist possesses, to make all these different parts work together. I would almost put this up there with, like, mid-90s Bound for Glory in terms of being a very underrated sort of thrash revival that doesn't get enough recognition from the scene at large. Like, Lucifugum was doing the retro thrash thing before we even knew what the fuck retro thrash was. They were just calling it their own weird kind of black metal. Turns out they were playing thrash along with Bound for Glory and Post Demon as Immortal way before it was cool to bring that style back. Speaking of bringing styles back, not only does this album have a bevy of solid black thrash riffs on it, but they also bring back a lot of the more proto-Druidic stylings of the And the Wheel Keeps Crunching album in a way that actually ties them in directly with the thrashing component. Again, like with As the Wheel Keeps Crunching, you got these jangly, kind of folky sounding sections, lots of clean guitar, but then the way that Roman's vocals are done is much more intensely rhythmic, almost like Tom Araya from Slayer decided to start a folk metal project. He's really spitting out those verses, and he's doing so with exceptionally hateful gusto. And the way they incorporate the more black metal guitars into that for transition work is pretty darn interesting. This fucking groove section right here, man, I really haven't heard anything else that sounds like this. It's like Druidic if they were a thrash metal band. Just this rolling melodic outpouring of hate, unfolding in all sorts of unexpected directions, like this mid-paced thrash bit right here. Get that real good, kind of slow, meaty headbang going. It vibes like a fucking Burzum album, but it also thrashes. And speaking of that sort of thing, check out this sort of collapsing section right here. Got that fading out guitar distortion, leading into some more clean guitar stuff, a nice bit of keyboard drone slowly fading in, because believe me, that black metal's coming back.
By getting money added back.
And when it does, man, it hits fucking hard. Like, that is some fucking quality atmospheric black metal shit. And it's not really the kind of emotional intensity you'd expect from an album that's got so much grooving black thrash shit on it. But that's the kind of stuff that Lucifugum excels in. Just doing weird stuff with black metal that you wouldn't even have thought was possible. And it is during this 2001 through 2003 period that they were at their most experimental and innovative, which is probably why it's my favorite era of Lucifugum. That's not to say that the stuff before it isn't also great, and that's definitely not to say that a lot of the stuff that came afterwards wasn't also cool. But you'll have to stick around for part 3 of the Lucifugum retrospective to hear about that kind of stuff. So hope to see you around for that and whatever other stuff Radio Free Innsmouth does in the future. Thanks for listening and watching wherever you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
안녕, 나는 총무부장이야.
She says like, comment, share, and subscribe. You don't want to make her mad, do you?
You know what I'm saying?